This is the finished look of my workshop. I wanted to put plywood on the walls because then I can mount, screw, hang, anything, anywhere I want without worry. In addition to the walls, I also put the same plywood on the ceiling for the same reasons. I have some ideas to work with the ceiling and I don't want to be restricted because it can't hang. Okay, let's get into it. Originally, I was going to go with 3/4 inch plywood, but after browsing the choices at my local lumber supply, I decided to go with this 1/2 inch Russian birch plywood. It's 9-ply, cabinet grade, and has a really good looking finished surface. The surface just looked way better than any of the other options available. It was bright, clean, and because it's cabinet grade, there would be little to no defects. Even though it was high quality, it was cheaper than the 3/4 inch plywood. Because the side yard is an uneven dirt pile the whole way down, the stack had to be dropped off in the front, which means I had to carry everything to the back, one piece at a time. I did the math and figured that it would take 53 sheets to cover the walls and ceiling. Just to be safe, I ordered 55, in case I'm bad at math or royally messed up a cut. I didn't need to get any more sheets, but it would have been pretty easy to get another sheet or two if needed. 55 is just too much for my truck to handle. It took just under an hour to move all 55 sheets from the front to inside the workshop. It was a good workout and I was hustling to try to move each sheet in less than a minute. I figured it would be easiest to work from the ground up, so I started with the bottom row. The rows above would rest on the row below it, all the way to the top. The bottom row was the trickiest because that's where all the electrical outlets and switches are. Each box has to be cut out individually. Because I was working solo, I came up with a system that worked pretty well. The vapor barrier gives a pretty good writing surface. I measured with a tape measure and wrote the measurements on the vapor barrier with a blue permanent marker. I kept the 4-foot height of each sheet. For the cuts, I measured the width of the sheet, the bottom and top of the outlets, and the left and right outlets from my control point. In this first case, I used the corner. I don't have a proper work table yet, so I just used the big stack of wood. I made sure the best looking side would be the side that faces out. I transferred the measurements that I wrote on the wall to the board. For the long cuts, I used a circular saw. For the outlet boxes, I first punched a hole with a spade and then cut out the box with a jigsaw. This was the first piece, so when the board didn't fit right, I figured that I just measured wrong. There's a small lip on the concrete curb at the base that these boards will sit on. This spot had a small imperfection, and it kept the board from sitting level. I used a cold chisel and hammer to chip out the extra concrete. It wasn't very much. Then the board sat flat. This is the only time I had that issue. I didn't go crazy with screws to hold it in. Pretty much just the top and bottom, and maybe some along the edges if needed. When I screw into the wall to hang tools and such, I'll know where the studs are based on these screws. The reason I'm using screws on these sheets as opposed to nails is so I can easily pull off a sheet and put it back on without damage. Or I can easily replace sheets for whatever reason. I followed the same process for the next sheet. If I could use full 8-foot wide sheets, I would. However, I want these edges to properly line up with the center of a stud, so 2 edges share a stud. And I have to work within the existing framing. That means I had to trim it down to fit. For the outlets, I measured from the edge of the previous sheet of wood to get the side-to-side locations. The first row was going pretty well. After a few, I was getting the hang of it. I ran into a tricky part here with the last piece on this side. The pipes for the sink were just different than outlet boxes. When I put the board in place, something just wasn't right. Then I realized that there was a clean out in the drain line sticking out of the wall that I forgot to cut through with the vapor barrier. No big deal, it just required an extra hole in the plywood. When I finished the first row on this side, instead of continuing the first row on the other side, I decided to just stay and work on the second row. The second row went so fast. I didn't stagger my seams because these are not structural at all, and I like the look of a clean grid pattern. For most of the boards, it was just one cut and slap on a board, one cut and throw the next board up, and so on and so on. The door was easy to measure and cut around, and so was the electrical panel box. I just got as close as I could for those. I was feeling really good about this side, so I kept going with the third row. This piece was tricky to measure. I'm trying to use as much of a full sheet as possible, and it's difficult to measure the height of a slope that's 12 feet up. I measured a few times before making any cuts. Now, this is the reason why I didn't want any windows in my workshop. Sunlight causes videos to look like this, and that's no good. I got the sheet up and continued with the third row on this side. In a perfect world, I would cut these sheets in half to use for these skinny sections. However, they all ended up needing to be just over a half sheet, ranging from 24.5 inches to 25.5 inches. This edge could not line up with a stud, so I put a thin metal piece as a backer so these corners would not bow in if you put pressure on them. I continued with this row to finish the walls on this side of the shop. The other side of the shop went faster and was even easier because it didn't have a door, electrical panel, or water pipes. Writing down the measurements in permanent marker will come in handy if I ever have to replace a sheet. I'll obviously remeasure, but I'll have a pretty good idea of the size of my sheet and the cuts I'll need to make because the markings will still be there. I had some extra time before the sunset, so I finished the triangle above the door opening. I just had to cut around the beam and get the plywood as close to the top edge as I could. Okay, all the walls are done. Now it's time for the ceiling. I rented a drywall lift for the day to do the flat ceiling. This lift could go up to 11 feet, so it'll be perfect for this 10 foot and some change ceiling. I took a bit of time figuring out how to arrange the sheets in the ceiling to make the most sense. There's probably a few other good ways to lay it out, but I decided on a very symmetrical plan. Just like before, I wrote down the measurements on the plastic. This was really just the best way to do it. I could easily just look at the markings from below and make sure I was transferring the measurements correctly. There's going to be decent sized lights covering these boxes, so I cut the holes a bit bigger and gave a little bit extra room so I didn't have to come back and recut a second time. That also made it a lot easier finagling the piece into the right spot. These first 4 pieces were all full sheets. The only cuts were for the light boxes. The drywall lift made this ceiling a piece of cake. I just had to put the board on the lift and crank it until it pressed into the ceiling. In addition to the screws at the edges, I put some screws through the middle of the sheet. Since these are hanging, they're entirely dependent on the screws. A good reason to add some more. This middle piece was 8 feet long like the others, but trimmed down a few inches to fit into the gap. To finish the flat ceiling, I cut out 8-foot long slivers to fill the left and right sides, and a small piece to fill the baby gap left in the center. I just used my head to hold it in place while I screwed it in. I thought that it would take an entire day to do the flat ceiling, but it went quicker than expected. So while I still had the lift, I popped on the first few sheets of the vaulted roof. The plywood on the walls go as high as I can make them, and the diagonal cuts for the tall wall also go up as high as I could get them. My room for error was a 1/2 inch, the thickness of the sheet. If I didn't get those cuts within a 1/2 inch, you'd see a gap at these edges. It was tricky putting these sheets up. Since the lift couldn't press the sheets into the ceiling, I had to push them into their final spot, causing them to warp just ever so slightly. It took a few tries to get right, but eventually I got them positioned correctly. I decided to not trim these sheets to line up on a stud, and instead kept them at their full size. If I'm hanging anything with weight from the ceiling, it'll be going into a stud, not just a sheet. Just like the flat ceiling, I added extra screws in the center of the sheet for more support. Once I put these 4 full sheets up, I had to go return this drywall lift. The next section I worked on was this triangle space between the vaulted ceiling and the flat ceiling. I started with rough measurements and cut a piece to general size. Just like the other side, my margin for error is a ½ inch at most. I screwed a few boards to the underside to make a temporary shelf. With my general piece up there, I used a straight edge board to trace just a portion of it at the correct angle. I used a long straight edge to continue the line and then cut it with a circular saw. Before taking it up there, I traced it on the next sheet because both sides are at the same angle, in a perfect world. The shelves made it easy to hold the piece in place while screwing it in. OSB doesn't take screws very well, so I tried my best to hit the studs when screwing it in. When the plywood sheet was mounted on, I removed the temporary shelves. The middle piece took a while to measure and cut out. It's such an odd shape because the beam is exposed. When I brought it up, I noticed that I had to trim just a bit more because of the hardware attached to the beam. To close out the 4th day, I cut and hung the small spaces left on this row of the vaulted ceiling. The upper corner of this piece wanted to bow in, so I added a backer at the corners so they'd all be flush. This other piece was a pain in the behind. I'm trying not to have any gaps in between sheets or at the edges, but for whatever reason, I couldn't get this piece to fit right. It took me several tries to get it hung properly without gaps at the seams. Eventually, I got it worked out. Okay, we're on the home stretch. To do the final part of the vaulted ceiling, I rented another drywall lift. I was told this one would go 12 to 16 feet, which is perfect because my ceiling is about 14 feet at the highest point. Well, that was not the case. This lift only went up to about 12, maybe 12 and a half feet. I already paid for the lift and didn't want to go through the hassle of returning it and refunds and such, so I just got creative. Instead of doing most of the work, the lift just became a delivery system. I like the idea of having a shelf to hold the sheet in place, so I screwed 2 scraps to the row below that overhung the seam and gave a lip to hold the next sheet. While the bottom was being held, I got back on my scaffolding of death, pushed the top piece into place, and popped in a screw or 2. I then hopped back on the ladder and screwed the bottom edge and removed the shelves. Then went back up to finish the top edge and add some in the middle. I like this order because if I needed to shift the piece into a different spot, I would know early and wouldn't have to remove that many screws to shimmy it around. Just so I didn't have to move the scaffolding around as much, I went ahead and installed the 3rd row above this piece. Since this piece has to tuck into the upper corner of the ceiling, I did it a bit differently. Instead of having the scraps overhang the seam, I put them on in a way where I could spin them after the piece was in place. Also, the camera is just sitting on the scaffolding, so that's how much it sways side to side while I'm working on it. Definitely not a place for the faint of heart. It's a little bit sketchy up here. I repeated the same process until the entire ceiling was finished. I made a bunch of cuts through this process and created a ton of sawdust. So the last step was to clean it all up and organize. I'm just in awe at how this room looks. It's been in the works for a long time, and it's finally here. It's finally a real place, and we're getting closer and closer to being done. Isn't this cool? Isn't this cool? Obviously the room is naked with nothing in here. There's nothing on the walls, no lights, no tools, no nothing. But he's still looking in here because this is where most of my building and construction will take place from now on. I'm stoked. I'm really stoked. And if you've been following along, I hope you are too. Oh, puppy. There's still a lot of work left to do before it's finally done, but hopefully I'll get to a place soon where I can start moving some stuff in and start making this place feel a little more like a workshop. Okay, that's it for now. See ya. Say bye. Bye. Oh, what's this? What's this?